to the front of the net. Puck work to the outside to Eklund. Howe back to Eklund again. Kerr sparring with Stevens in front. Eklund creeps behind. Out in front to Curry. Scores! Tim Kerr and the Flyers are perfect on 5-on-3s. They are 3 for 3. Get their first power play goal of the night and tie the game.
Hey everybody, it's Isaiah. Just reminding you that FlyersNittyGritty.com and the O&B Puckcast are brought to you by Summit Public Adjusters. Hey, do you have damage to your home? Not sure who to call? We suggest that you call Summit Public Adjusters before your insurance company. Dealing with your insurance company can be very stressful. Let Summit take the stress out of the claims process. From storm damage to your roof, to toilet overflows, to broken pipes and fires, Summit gets you the most money for your repairs. So next time Mother Nature leaves you in need of repairs, call Summit Public Adjusters at 215-752-0560 or visit summitpublicadjusters.com. Licensed in PA and New Jersey.
And we are back. It is Isaiah. And we want to welcome you to the O&B Puckcast, episode 121. And Chef has the night off, but have no fear. With us tonight, as always, is the great Dan Silver. How you doing, man?
I'm good. How you doing?
All right. And we are really excited for a first-time O&B guest. You know him, of course. He's from the Athletic Philadelphia and Broad Street Hockey Podcast, probably the premier beat writer on the scene today. And his name is Charlie O'Connor. How you doing, man?
Hey, guys. It's awesome to be on the show. Thanks for having me.
Great. Well, you have, to put it in a word, been prolific lately on The Athletic. You got to check that out, his work, Charlie's work there. And like you said, one of your articles, like a flurry of 5 or 6 over the last few days. The Flyers are at a pivot point this July, and there's just so much at stake. And in that particular article by that, name, Charlie, you talked about, hey, this is the offseason where we can reasonably expect the Flyers to do something. Everything just kind of sits right that now Fletcher really has to make a move. The management is there. The fans are restless. This is the time right now. And, of course, you have the contract situations with Drew and Couturier. Why don't you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think kind of where the Flyers stand right now, which is why this is such a pivotal offseason for Chuck Fletcher, is in past years, I think there was an element in the front office of feeling that maybe doing something could be riskier than not doing something, and I think that might have played into why they were more conservative than maybe some fans would have wanted them to be. It was the idea that, we're building for the future. We're building around this young core. We have to keep the prospects to build up, the under 25 pipeline, from draft and developing up to the Flyers, up to the big club. But this offseason strikes me as different because I think it's just as risky, if not more so, to do nothing. Because, it's plausible. I'm not saying it's likely, but it's plausible to imagine the Flyers, largely sitting out this offseason. It turns out that the debacle that was the 2020-21 season was basically just a product of, COVID-19, the pandemic, all the challenges. And they come back next year with the same team and they're good. But it's just as possible that there's something, inherently wrong with the structure of this team, or the team would be better, but still nowhere near cup contending good. And if that's the case, then as you mentioned, you got guys like Claude Giroux, guys like Sean Couturier, their contracts are up at the end of next season. And you put yourself in a position where, if there's no serious I guess, move. I'm not saying move in the sense of a trade or a signing, but no serious move from the team next season to take that step towards legitimate contention, then you wonder, what are those guys going to do? Or is it possible those guys could, Claude Giroux will be 34. Maybe he wants to chase a cup. He doesn't think he's going to win a cup here. Maybe he looks elsewhere. Sean Couturier, maybe he's not thinking, I'll give these guys a discount. Maybe he'll hit free agency. Like, the Flyers at this point can't necessarily just figure, well, we'll sit in our hands, and that sitting on their hands is just as much of a risk in my mind as doing things, which also is a risk, because obviously you make a trade where you're trading away young players for a veteran guy, or you're trading away prospects and picks, for someone that helps the team now. That's a risk, because you don't know how those trades are going to play out. But it's just as much of a risk to me to do nothing, because right now, in my estimation, and I think in the front office's estimation as well, this team is not good enough to contend. So you either take the risk of, this past year basically just being a fluke, and the young players are all going to keep taking steps forward, and the older players are all going to hold to their talent levels, or you say it's probably not going to be good enough, and you start making some changes, you start making some ads, and you really start to go for it. And I think the Flyers are going to try to do that. Now, whether they can pull it off or not, that remains to be seen. But I just think there's so much of being a general manager in this league is about, risk assessment. And if you're going into this offseason and you don't acknowledge that there's a serious risk in doing nothing, then you're not doing a good job. And I think the Flyers, the front office, Chuck Fletcher, I think they understand that, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. Dan?
Yeah, so, before I ask, I guess, my first question, I just want to say, whenever a Flyers fan who may just be getting into hockey or the sport asks me, who should I be following? What should I be doing? Immediately, the first thing, as I say, is you need to get an Athletic subscription. It's literally worth the price just to read Charlie's article, because
thanks, Dan.
It's the honest truth. Like, you could literally. And I say this, to my mom. She gets into the Flyers, and I got her subscription to The Athletic. But you could literally, just read Charlie's articles. And, yeah, there may be some, bad opinions, and there are not nearly as many bad opinions as most people. But, from a, comprehensive, here's what's going on with the team, you need to have an Athletic subscription and read Charlie's stuff. It's my utmost admiration for the stuff that you do. It's great.
You bet.
Thanks, guys.
So this team, and I guess they fooled me, maybe because I'm trying to be overly optimistic. It was such a crazy season, not this past season, but the season a few years ago, because from January through the round robin round of the bubble, this team looked like one of the best teams in the league. And then in the bubble, they go on and they win a series in which they didn't look like they played all that well, but they win the series. Carter Hart's really good. And then they take the Islanders to 7 games, again, in a series where they didn't look that great. And that offseason was, there were kind of two camps. There was the camp that I was in, which was trying to be overly optimistic. You know what? This team, the young kids are going to take a step forward. And this is the year that they could really contend for a cup. And then there was the other group, which Isaiah was in, and a lot of people were in, saying, you know what, they got within a game of the semifinals in the bubble, but they didn't look that good. And this looks like a team that there's a lot of problems with, and things could kind of fall apart. And I feel like the front office maybe was almost in the same boat that I was in, looking at it like, you know what, all we really need is we need these young kids to take a step forward, and we're going to be a cup contending team. And then this year was an unmitigated disaster. And I guess you kind of just talked about it, but first of all, have you ever seen a team like what they did a couple years ago, where it was so hard to kind of figure out what the real team was? And then I guess it's, in a way, it's sort of good what happened last year, because it to me, it left no doubt whatsoever that, despite the however much you want to blame on the pandemic, that they need to do things this offseason.
Yeah. I think there's probably a middle ground there, between the two sides, because, the point I've made in a few of my columns is that I do believe that the primary reason why this past season was such a disaster for the Flyers is because everything looks worse when you're getting the worst goaltending in hockey. and I mean, it does. Everything looks worse when you have the worst save percentage by a full percentage point, and things aren't as bad as they seem because I don't believe that Carter Hart is a true talent worst starting goaltender in the NHL. I don't believe that's the case. I'm expecting him in some form or another to bounce back. I'm also expecting the Flyers to get a better backup in the offseason than Brian Elliott, so I'm expecting an improvement there. That said, even if you assume that there was a fluky element to it just because Carter Hart isn't that bad, and the Flyers next year should not expect they are going to have the worst goaltending in hockey, the team, even with that, showed me this past season that they are not good enough. They're not good. They're maybe good enough to be a playoff team with, league average or, a bit above league average goaltending. I think they probably have the talent on the roster to be a playoff team, a bottom half of the 16 teams type of playoff team. But what this season showed me is that if you're expecting this group as currently constituted, and I guess I'm talking specifically about the skaters, if you're expecting this group as currently constituted to be able to be one of the 5 or 6 best teams in hockey, they're just not that good. So if you want to get them to be that good, you got to make adjustments. And, I don't quite agree with the people who think that like the sky is falling and it's a total disaster, but I do agree that another offseason of sitting on your hands, it's fine if you just want to make the playoffs and lose in round 1. But if you actually want to take this foundation, of young talent, of prospects, of, the veterans they have that are still good, if you want to take this foundation and you want to take it to the next level, they need more pieces. They need an upgraded defense. They need a different mix up front. I mentioned the backup goalie. They definitely need an upgraded Brian Elliott who can, carry the load if necessary. But there's flaws of this team. There's holes on this team. I think, and Dan, I think we've talked about this on Twitter before. It was something I pointed out in the offseason. We had a conversation about it. The idea that the Flyers lack a dynamic player. Sean Couturier, I think, is a great player, a great all-around player. He's not the kind of guy that scares defenses. And I think the Flyers really could use that guy. I don't know if they can get him. I don't know if they can get him this offseason. But if you don't have a dynamic player, a guy who at every time he's on the ice, teams have to be aware. And if they're not aware, he's going to score. If you don't have that, you basically just need to have truly incredible depth and also a really good goalie. And they might have the really good goalie in Carter Hart. Hopefully he bounces back for the Flyers. But they don't have the kind of, 1 through 4 lines, pairings 1 through 3, the kind of depth that allows you to survive not having that elite player, that true dynamic threat. And either you get him or you really got to make sure that this team is deep enough to overcome the fact that you don't have that player. And to me, that's the thing they're lacking. They're lacking that extra little bit that takes them from being a good true talent team to being a team that actually is a cup threat, which I don't believe they are as currently constituted.
Real quick, did you see Chris Therrien's tweet yesterday?
I did not.
Okay. So yesterday, Chris Therrien, who I'm sure has some residual feelings towards the Flyers based on, him losing his job, but still probably a guy whose opinion is, worthwhile. He sends out a tweet yesterday. Lots of NHL Flyers chatter today regarding upcoming expansion draft, free agency, etc. This is not a playoff team, and 1 or 2 moves will not propel them into the postseason next spring either. I'd rather they say they are in a rebuild and be honest. I got to be honest, I was a little bit taken aback by this tweet he sent out. I mean, and again, maybe it has to do with kind of some of his feelings, but that's pretty harsh, right?
No, it is. And I mean, I know Chris. I've talked to him before. And he's certainly, entitled to that opinion. And, you can't ignore the opinion of someone who played in the league. He's seeing things that, someone like me who obviously did not play in the league, is not going to see. And I'm sure he's privy to, some behind the scenes things that I might not be. That said, I mean, I do disagree with him. I don't think that this team is actively bad, in every, the point I'll make is that the Flyers got the worst goaltending in hockey. worst goaltending in hockey this past season by far, and they finished with the 19th best record in the NHL. Now, like, granted, that's not acceptable. 19th is not good enough, but like, you got the worst goaltending in hockey, and you were, theoretically 3 slots away from being ostensibly a playoff team. Now, obviously, the way the divisions fall, that's not necessarily how it's going to work out, but like, even if they just get league average goaltending, they're probably like a top 12 team. So to me, it's not that like things are so bad that they need to blow it up. It's that they can't, if they do nothing, if they stay where they are, they're just going to stay in that, like, just good enough to be a playoff team. And then when things go bad, they miss the playoffs. But true talent wise, they're probably one of the best, or probably somewhere in like the, 8 to 14 range. And if that's good enough for the Flyers, then it's just going to serve to frustrate fans every year, because you're going to have flashes of, runs, 2-week-long stretches. They look really good, and then they're going to struggle, and they'll slip into the playoffs, and maybe they win a round. But I think expectations should be higher internally. And I think they are, but I'm not of the camp that I think this team is bad. I'm just also not in the camp that, this team as is can take a step without things being done to the roster. So that's where I would disagree with Chris. I would say that, I don't think that the Flyers are a total dumpster fire as they are now. And I do think that this past year made things look worse than they were. But that doesn't mean that just because they made things look worse than they were, that doesn't mean that things are good. And I think there needs to be a clear distinction between those two positions, because I find myself somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, that is absolutely amazing, Dan, that you brought that up, because I cut my mic for a second to take a screenshot of a tweet that I remembered I forgot to put in the notes. And you know what tweet it was? It was Chris Turian. Amazing. I swear that just happened. Anyway,
I can read mine. Isaiah.
Yeah, I think you can. But yeah. The other thing is, Charlie, I think if there's a clue or a window into Chris's mind, I'm thinking maybe it's cultural in terms of the care factor or the culture, identity of the team. And that's kind of like an intangible that the player might be able to see something that we, the fans, and even someone like yourself who's around the team might not be able to get to that level to have that understanding.
I think that's fair, and I easily could see that being one of the things that really rubbed him the wrong way, because this was a team this past year that, in a lot of ways, and it's tough to know exactly what was going on internally, but on the ice, it just seemed like a lot of times they didn't seem like they necessarily were fully engaged with the game. And I'm not saying all the players, like I think Claude Giroux is absolutely an exception. And I think at times he got frustrated that, he's driving the boat here and everybody else is just kind of swimming in the lake. But I think that probably really rubbed someone like Terry in the wrong way, who, was a high effort, heart and soul type of guy, who maybe wasn't the most talented NHL defenseman in the world, but got the most out of his talent. And when guys are, Claude Giroux is trying to drag his team into the fight every night, and they're just not doing it. It takes until they're down 5-2 before they really start skating. You have situations where, guys are getting beat up on and no one's backing them up. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that I'm sure as a former player you watch and you just get infuriated. That said, I mean, the weird part about last season was that those sort of things, the idea of like sticking up for teammates, the idea of high energy hockey, the idea of, a team with a good work ethic, those were strengths the previous year. So like, I think that they can get back to that. Like, I think back to, there was a game in the 2019-2020 season. It was Flyers, Senators, and Travis Konecny got hit and he got a concussion on the play. And the rest of the game, the whole team, pretty much led by Scott Laughton, was like going around trying to murder every single player on the Sens. And they win the game. Laughton scores the game-winning goal. He screams at the Sens bench, does a flyby on his goal. And then I believe Brady Tkachuk like jumped him, and they took a penalty, and that was the end of the game essentially, because he was so mad that Laughton had dared to disrespect their entire bench after he scored. But like, that's the kind of stuff that I imagine, someone like Therrien would have been like, that's great. That's a team. That's a bunch of guys that are fighting for each other. And for whatever reason, that's pretty much that same bunch of guys didn't do that last year. And that's where I wonder, what was the impact of, the schedule, the demanding, schedule that these guys were dealing with. What was the impact of the COVID pause, things like that, because those sort of things, I would be more concerned that there's just something broken if that the team didn't show that before, but they have. This group has shown the ability. I mean, I covered the team in 2019, 2020, and one thing that really struck me about the team was how close they were. I mean, they were tight. They were a tight bunch that really liked going to work and really liked each other. And my understanding of the way it was by the end of this season was that they could not wait until this season got done. They were sick of everything that had to do with the 2020-21 season. And I think that bled into their on-ice play and how they looked out there, because the fans certainly noticed, and I'm sure Chris Therien noticed. But I think you can get that back. I think you have to make some adjustments. You have to maybe add a different voice in the locker room. Maybe you have to add, one guy who I like as a potential depth add is Matt Calvert, who I think would bring that type of energy and that kind of like stick up for your teammates mentality that I think the bottom six could use. But you need a couple pieces like that. Guys that bring the team into the fight in a way that Claude Giroux might try, but maybe he's not the kind of vocal leader that can do that necessarily. And he's also just not a physical player, because that's just not necessarily his game. He's older, he's worn down a bit, even though he's adjusted his game. But that was sort of a long-winded way to say that I do think that there's something to that critique. I just don't think it's unfixable, if that makes sense.
Sure.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I wanted to ask something about one of the guys that you mentioned in your article about some UFAs that you might want them to go after, and tie it into something that to me is like probably a different way that the front office might be looking at going into this season as last season. Like I feel like last season, maybe there was a comfort level with saying, hey, you know what, some of the young guys are going to take a step forward. 3C, either we're going to get, Nolan Patrick or Morgan Frost, or one of these guys is really going to step up. And, part of the dumpster fire last year was, Frost, obviously no fault of his own, had the injury early on, and sure. Nolan Patrick just kind of just didn't really work out. To me, now they have to go into this season thinking, hey, you know what, some of these roles that are still a little bit unclear, we need to fill with people that we know that they can do the job. And I think obviously the top pairing defenseman is one of those. I'm sure we'll talk about that at some point. But one of the guys you mentioned in your article who you said would be kind of like a low key, nice pickup. And you're talking about 3C was like a Nick Bonino. And to me, that sort of symbolizes like, if they won't go out and get someone like that, just sort of shows that, they know that maybe they can't rely on some of these young guys taking a step forward. So what are your thoughts on that overall? And then kind of like bringing in a guy like a Bonino just to be, third line center, you can just plug him in.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be totally fine with that. I think the 3C hole is, and this is something I believe that the Flyers are very aware of. The conversations that I've had with people in the organization over the past couple of months, they're concerned about, the center depth, because it's just, you don't know what you have really in Nolan Patrick at this point. Morgan Frost, I think they still like. I don't think they've given up on him, but he missed all last year due to injury, and, he's kind of, for a prospect, he's kind of getting older. Like, this really is a make or break year for him as a prospect coming up. And I don't think you can go into the season, just assuming that Morgan Frost is going to, slide in and be your 3C from day one. And I don't think you can go into the season, if Nolan Patrick survives the offseason with the Flyers, just expecting that Nolan Patrick will, treat it that like last season didn't happen. He's still at least like a, 30 to 35 point a year, decent third line center. It's a concern, and you might be able to piecemeal together some 3C quality play by, you having Giroux at center sometimes and using Lawton there. And, maybe you try to, squeeze all the way to the trade deadline, then you go out and get somebody. But it's so much easier to control games when you can roll 3 quality centers at other teams. It's so much easier. I mean, you kind of saw it with with the Islanders, how they took a real step forward when they were able to get Jean-Gabriel Pageau, and then you could roll Barzal, Nelson, and Pageau at teams. It just makes you so much tougher to match up against. And Bonino, obviously isn't a superstar by any means. He's a role player, but he's good in his role, and he shouldn't come too expensive. He's absolutely the type of guy where if you're serious about contending this season, set aside some money and go get him, or go get someone like him, whether it's free agency or trade. I've said on multiple occasions that I think ideally the Flyers shouldn't just be looking at getting a top pair defenseman. Get that guy. Absolutely. You need to get that Niskanen replacement. But I ideally would want them to get another right-handed shot defenseman to play with Travis Sanheim and then really solidify your top four. Like in that second tier, you're talking like the Adam Larsons, the David Savards, people like that. That said, I don't know if you can do both that, get that second guy on defense and address 3C. So if that's the route they go, I kind of wonder if it might be like one or the other type of thing. And in that type of situation, I could legitimately see them prioritizing the third line center spot, because I do believe they understand that it's a serious weakness. It's been a serious weakness. They rolled the dice on Nolan Patrick and Morgan Frost last year and they got burned. And I don't think you can afford to try that again.
Big advocate of that myself, because I guess that brings me to Nolan Patrick. It's one of those questions about how the organization feels about him. You listen to Fletcher on Sirius XM, and the talent is there. He's going to get in shape this year. Like making it sound like they're excited that Nolan got last year out of the way. But then on the other side of the coin, you hear that Nolan's on his third agent, and there are some sources locally that have said he's not really happy here. I mean, what's your opinion about how all that shapes out?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to, whether Nolan Patrick definitely wants out or not. I mean, obviously, I've seen those reports as well. I haven't been able to get anybody to confirm one way or the other. It has been hinted to me that, he's not necessarily opposed to the idea of a trade. And I can tell you that from what I've heard around the organization, a year ago, 2 years ago, the idea of trading Nolan Patrick was, it might have been thrown out there, in the blogosphere a little bit. I don't think it was ever a serious consideration for the organization. I think they were pretty high on him. They liked his upside and they wanted to see how things played out. They wanted to get him past the migraine disorder, and then was like, they were really excited. We'll get him back, and we'll get this second overall pick, really talented guy back, and we'll see what he can do. I get the sense that now they are open to the idea of trading him. Like, I'm not necessarily saying they're definitely going to trade him, but there's an openness to the concept this summer that was not there before. So add in the fact that, there's rumblings that Nolan might not, be super happy here, that he might think that it's just not working here. Maybe if I go somewhere else, I'll go back to being the player that I believe I am and the player that I was in juniors. And if that's the case, that's something I put in my article. I think it was the final one for the perfect offseason article I did. And it's basically like, you just got to figure out the situation. I'm not saying you have to trade Nolan Patrick, but what I am saying is that you got to get an understanding from this kid if he's really invested in the idea of being a Philadelphia Flyer. And if he is, like, I'm not saying that means don't trade him, but if he is, great. Then maybe you can roll with him next year. You give him the full off season to really work out and be ready, and maybe you can still make this work. But if you get the sense that he's not fully invested in being a Philadelphia Flyer, to me, one of the big reasons why that 2019-2020 team, exceeded expectations and for a time looked like a really good team is because there was universal buy-in from everybody. It was a tight team. They had chemistry. They played for each other. They were, they adhered to the system. They believed in the system. They were doing things without thinking. And if Patrick isn't happy in Philly and if he wants out, like, I don't know if you can afford to have a guy who doesn't really want to be here, because I don't know if the Flyers are talented enough to have those kind of guys on the team. So to me, like, figuring out the Nolan Patrick situation for me isn't necessarily like you got to trade him, but you do have to have a resolution to this. And it doesn't have to be something that has to be publicly known. But I don't think you can afford to have a Nolan Patrick who doesn't want to be in Philadelphia. I don't think you can afford to have him on your team. So you got to figure out if he does want to be in Philadelphia. And if he doesn't, then, maybe he's a secondary piece in a deal that you do, for a defenseman or for a shake it up on the forward mix, something like that. But there needs to be full buy-in. I don't think there was full buy-in this past season, especially when things started going bad and guys started getting frustrated. And there needs to be full buy-in, especially on the defensive end of the puck. And, they need to figure out if Nolan Patrick is fully invested in being a Philadelphia Flyer. And, if he's not, It would be really disappointing, for the organization and for the fans who put so much, hope on him when the team won the lottery, and he showed flashes his rookie year, definitely. But I guess my point is that you can't keep throwing ice time at a guy if it's just not working, and they need to figure out this summer if it can work or if it's just not going to work. And if it's just not going to work, then maybe it's time to move on.
Yeah. So Charlie, let's dig into the defense. Dan, were you gonna?
Yeah, no, go ahead. That's what I was going to bring up.
Yeah, it's the elephant in the room. It's the one thing that is absolutely compulsory. If they do nothing this offseason, they have to get a defenseman. And there's all kind of rumors out there about the Flyers' pursuit of Seth Jones, but then the Flyers wanting to make sure that he would sign and make a long-term commitment, which Elliot Friedman said he's not sure that Philly is one of those teams, that there may be some other teams that Seth Jones would commit to. What's with the latest that you were hearing? And maybe if Seth Jones is off the table because the Flyers don't want to they want to solve this problem, right beside Provorov, who are some of the alternatives if Seth Jones doesn't work out?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard some similar things. I've heard that that right now Seth Jones isn't willing to commit to a long-term deal in Philly. I think there might be teams that he would be. The question is whether those types of teams are actually interested in trading for him, or maybe have interest but maybe aren't willing to pay the price that Columbus wants them to pay. Do I think it shuts the door on Seth Jones? Not necessarily. There could be a situation where maybe the price goes down enough that the Flyers are okay with essentially trading for him as a rental that we have to then pitch him over the next year on the idea of signing long-term in Philadelphia. I think I could see that being an option. But again, you're not going to pay the same price that you were willing to pay for Seth Jones with an extension that you're going to pay for Seth Jones as a rental. And if there's teams that have the ability to get Seth Jones with an extension, they're obviously going to be willing to offer more than you will if you are getting Seth Jones as a rental. So that's where the complication comes to play. But I don't think the Seth Jones idea is dead. I just think that, it adds another wrench. If Seth Jones was like, yeah, I definitely would re-sign in Philadelphia to, the first day I can, if Philly trades for me, yeah, I think, we'd be seeing more momentum going on than there is right now. But apparently that's not the case. At least that's my understanding. If it's not Seth Jones, I mean, I could definitely see them swinging back around on Dougie Hamilton. Like, I don't think they were, there was talk that he wasn't their top target, but that doesn't mean he wasn't a target.
Right.
They obviously know that they need a top pair defenseman, or they need some type of impact defenseman, and he qualifies. So I could certainly see them circling back around on him. Nashville's in an interesting spot. I could definitely see them trying to, see if, the situation with Ekholm and Ellis. I know that they've talked at least preliminary with Minnesota about Matt Dumba. I don't think he's their top choice for reasons that I agree with. I don't know if Matt Dumba is a top pair defenseman. He might be a really, really good second pair defenseman. And, that's maybe a last resort type thing, but he's a right-handed shot. He would help the power play. Stylistically, he might work with Provorov because Dumba's more of an offensively oriented guy. And I think Provorov, in terms of his impact at 5-on-5, is actually better defensively than offensively. So it could work. I think fans would like, how much Dumba hits. He's definitely a physical guy. But I don't necessarily think that he's, their top choice. I just think he's an option. There's options out there. And, one thing that I've been told by the people I've talked to in the game, and I'm aware that it's a vague statement, and I'm not making it vague because I have 10 names in my head that I can't note, that I've been told, but I'm sworn to secrecy. I've just been told by people that there are more players available than you think. There are guys that are going to be traded over the next 2 or 3 weeks that you don't even know are out there. And one of those guys that, I think was probably somebody this person was thinking of when he told me was Vladimir Tarasenko, who until that trade request went public, I don't think anybody really knew that he was seriously out there. And now it seems like a foregone conclusion that he's going to get moved. And I think there's guys like that, and maybe they don't necessarily fit the bill of top pair right-hand defensemen, but there's guys available that I think are going to surprise when they get moved. At least that's my understanding. That's what I've heard from people I've talked to in the game. So, I'm sort of expecting a pretty wild next 3 weeks, not necessarily just from the Flyers, but just from the league as a whole, because I think a lot of teams want to shake things up. The expansion draft provides another reason for that, and I think it's going to be interesting. So, if Seth Jones isn't going to work out for the Flyers, I don't necessarily think that means that the Flyers are screwed from a, acquiring an impact defenseman type of thing, because I think there might be guys available that we don't even realize are available.
Gotcha.
That could be like a summer movie preview. Like, there are guys out there you've never even heard of.
That's right. Yeah.
You have no idea who they are. They're gonna be available. Like, wow, that's actually got me a little excited. That'll be interesting to track. Real quick, I mean, my Seth Jones opinion, and obviously it's complicated. It's, there's complications as you mentioned, but I would be perfectly fine, if not happier, getting him on a 1-year rental, because this is such a pivot point year for the organization that if you can give up less to get him, because of the Giroux situation, I'm pretty sure he'll finish his career, you would think, and the Couturier situation in the last years of their deals, like, it almost would make sense to have Jones as this year where, prove you're worth the money. There's still a lot of people out there who look at the analytics and, say he's fallen off a cliff. And so it would be kind of interesting to have him here on a 1-year deal. But as you mentioned, the issue is that I'm sure the Columbus is going to keep trying to talk to teams that he will extend with so that they can get a bigger return.
Exactly.
So it's obviously very complicated. The other thing that Elliot Friedman mentioned, which again, you sort of never know what's being put out there as posturing by agents and whoever, but he talked about Jake Voracek a little bit. And he said it's not an acrimonious situation, but that the Flyers and Voracek have discussed it might be time for a change. Voracek has been told that he's going to be left unprotected for the expansion draft. This is according to Elliot Friedman. And the expansion draft is so interesting. To me, it just got that much more interesting when they named Dave Haxtell as head coach. Like, I'm sort of expecting him to take Robert Haig because, per Haxtell, he's like a better defenseman than Travis Sanheim originally. But, what are you thinking on the expansion draft? What do you think of the Voracek thing? How do you kind of see that playing out?
So what I'll say about Voracek is, I heard very similar things about the idea that he had been told that he's not going to be protected. There's a reason why in all of my articles guessing at who's going to be protected that I did not include Jake Voracek over my last couple, because and the thing is if you're not going to protect him, that's a conversation as a general manager you have to have with the player. You can't blindside a guy who's been on the team for almost a decade, who I guess now will be a decade because they got him in the summer of 2011. But who's a leader, who's a top scorer, who's a guy at the top of the lineup. If you're not going to protect him, you have to have that tough conversation with him. You got to give him the heads up, or else rightfully he's going to feel disrespected. So that was something I'd heard. That didn't surprise me at all. The idea of him being the guy going to Seattle, the idea that maybe it's time for a change. I always assumed, and this was just straight up in terms of looking at, the cap situation and just having plain old common sense. If you want to get a top tier defenseman, you got to move some serious money out. And, JVR to me always made sense because, as the guy, that you try to push Seattle to, because he's got better underlying numbers still than Jake Voracek does. And JVR only has 2 more years left on a $7 million cap hit, whereas Jake Voracek has 3 more years left on an $8.25 million cap hit. So it was easier for me to imagine Seattle being open to the idea of taking on JVR than being open to the idea of taking on Jake Voracek, which is why I kind of was always like, JVR makes more sense to me as that clear the cap space to get a defenseman type of move, because I think it's easier to move him. That said, Jake Voracek is another option as a guy who you could move to clear that cap space. And in truth, I think JVR had a better season this past year than Jake Voracek. JVR has shown me fewer signs of age-related slippage than Jake Voracek has. And you're clearing up more cap space if you trade Jake Voracek versus JVR. So it makes sense to me that he would be the Flyers' first choice as a guy to clear up that space to make the moves they want to make. That said, it goes back to what I said earlier. I think it would be harder to move him. And that's why in the end, if I had to put money on it, I think Jake Voracek stays a Flyer because it's going to be really tough to move that contract. Especially in a stagnating cap world. He's 32 years old, or he turns 32, I believe, in August. But he's just it's a tough contract to move. And if Fletcher can move it, then, I guess, they'll probably try. But I have always viewed JVR as the easier way to get the space they need to make the moves that they want to make. But it makes sense to me that they might be trying to see if they can move Voracek first before they have to go down that path.
So, I mean, I think, most people in their expansion list for the Flyers aren't including Voracek or JVR. And so I was kind of interested where Friedman came out and said, well, specifically about Voracek about this. And then again, you start thinking, okay, is he just being kind of told that because the Flyers want it out there that, he's being left unprotected? Is your assumption also that JVR is also going to be left unprotected?
Yes. I think assuming that no moves are made, my guess for the forwards that are going to be protected is Couturier, Giroux, Hayes. Giroux and Hayes obviously have the no movement clause. They have to be protected. Konechny, Lawton, Lindblom, and Patrick. I think those are the 7. Now, obviously, the Patrick situation is fluid. You don't know if maybe he's involved in a trade before the expansion draft. That's possible. But I think that if he's still on the team, I think he would be protected because I think they view him as an asset they wouldn't want to lose for nothing. And they look at guys like JVR and Voracek where, number one, their contracts might serve as protection enough. Number two, if they're taken, that clears the cap space they need to clear to make the moves they want to make anyway. So it's more of like a strategic thing than anything else. Like they certainly don't think that Nolan Patrick is a better player than James Van Riemsdyk or Jake Voracek, but it just makes sense for the type of offseason they're trying to have. So yeah, I fully expect that both JVR and Voracek will be left unprotected.
So I would think with Voracek that you would obviously have to, sweeten the pot. I would also think with JVR you probably would too. Do you think there's a chance that they could take a JVR without any kind of pot sweetening? If not, do you think that the Flyers are in a position where they're, going to be happy or okay with, trading picks or a prospect to sweeten the pot for a JVR Seattle acquisition?
I think it's possible that they could take a JVR without having to pay for them to do it. That said, I mean, it would turn into, kind of a staring contest because I guarantee you that, Ron Francis in Seattle, if they look at the Flyers and they decide, okay, our top choice is James Van Riemsdyk, that's who we want. There's nothing stopping Ron Francis from going to Chuck Fletcher and trying to basically position it as, we'll take JVR off your hands, but you have to give us something. And then it just comes down to whether Fletcher believes him, whether Fletcher thinks that like, okay, is he lying to me and he's just trying to get a pick out of me when he's just going to take him anyway? Or is he telling me the truth? And if I don't pay him, he's going to poach Nicolas Aube-Kubel, or he's going to poach Justin Braun or Shane Gostisbehere. That's where it gets into, a staring contest where you're waiting to see who blinks first. And, if Chuck Fletcher basically just says, sorry, I'm not paying you to take anybody, take who you want, that's it, that's all. I think there's a chance that Seattle looks at it and is like, yeah, we want a guy like JVR. We're going to take him for nothing. But there's no way that would happen without at least that posturing to begin with. And then it just comes down to whether Chuck Fletcher is willing to take the risk that what Seattle is telling him is actually posturing, and it's not them telling him the flat out truth that if you don't give us a second round pick, we will not take James Van Riemsdyk.
So my last follow-up on this one is I'm going to make you the GM, and you're talking about JVR with Ron Francis. Where do you, and let's just say we're talking about draft picks to make it easy. where do you draw the line of what you would give them to take JVR? Is it a third-round pick? Do you draw the line between a second and a third, between a third and a fourth? You're the GM. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. To me, anything below a third-round pick, I mean, that's all just lottery tickets anyway, so I don't really care. If you had to give them a fourth-round pick to take JVR, like, sure, fine. The Flyers have enough prospects. It's not the end of the world if you lose a fourth-round pick. But that said, I'm sure that Seattle will be asking for more than that. Right. Let me put it this way: if they're willing to take JVR, if their demand is a fourth-round pick to take JVR, it almost tells you, as if you're Chuck Fletcher, that like, well, they're going to take him anyway. Like if that's their low ask, like they don't care. They're just trying to get a tax out of us. But at that point, you might as well just be like, you know what? No, we're not doing anything because you're going to take him anyway. So have him. It's all yours. The more interesting question to me is if you're really in on this idea of moving Voracek instead, it's like, what would you be willing to pay to move him? Because to have him be taken by Seattle, because the tough part about this is that it's really important for the Flyers to clear cap space because functionally they can't make the ads they want to make unless they clear cap space. That said, if you give up too many assets to clear the cap space, then suddenly you don't have the assets you need to make the moves. So you have to really thread the needle in this situation because you don't want to, like, let's say you decide we're getting rid of Voracek, and the cost to get rid of Voracek is you have to pay Seattle a first-round pick to take Jake Voracek. Well, that's great. You got rid of Jake Voracek, but now you don't have a first-round pick. And then what if Columbus is like, well, we're only going to trade Seth Jones if there's a first-round pick in here, and it's got to be in this draft? Well, that first-round pick is gone now. So you're in a tough spot where, you need to clear the cap space, but you also want to preserve as many assets as possible to give yourself the kind of flexibility to make the ads you want to make with the cap space you just got yourself, which is why, I mean, look, every fan's dream job is to be a GM, but it's not an easy job. So that's why they make the big bucks, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And well, it helps at least that Columbus already has 2 or 3 first-round draft picks, so maybe that could be substituted for a player. You never know. But so Charlie, you wrote a great article, what a perfect Philadelphia Flyers offseason would look like, 10 steps to get back to contention. Well, I would invite everybody to check that out at The Athletic. But tonight, maybe we could go through 2 scenarios, like the bare minimum the Flyers really have to do to have a representative offseason, and then maybe some bonus moves that would kind of dovetail with the article that you wrote.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the bare minimum to me is you absolutely need to get an impact defenseman. Like if it's a Matt Dumba type, I could accept it. I don't think it's enough, but if I squint, I could see it working, and it's like, fine. You showed that you understand the big weakness on this defense, and you did your best to address it. You got the best possible guy you could. So that's number one. Number two is you need an upgrade in goal. Like you need an upgrade to that backup spot just in case Carter Hart is going down the path of Matt Murray. I don't think he is, but you can't have goaltending torpedo a second straight season. I think Hart's going to bounce back, but you need that insurance, and you need a better backup than Brian Elliott. So to me, like, those are the 2 things that bare minimum you got to do it. And I guess in order to do that, you need to move a big money guy because you're not going to have the cap space to be able to add a top pair defenseman or an impact level defenseman and pay more for your backup goalie than you were paying for Brian Elliott unless you move out of JVR or a Voracek or at least a Shane Gostisbehere, because you functionally can't do it. You can't add those players without moving out some space to fit them. So I would say those 3 things are the, bare minimum. You got to do these things or else the offseason is a flat out failure. Then other things, the other things of being like I had in this piece, get a dynamic forward. I talked about that. Like, look, that would be a fantastic move for the Flyers if they can pull it off. It's not easy. I mean, there aren't that many dynamic forwards out there, so I'll understand it if they can't get one of them. It would be the perfect offseason, but that's not something where, like, if they don't end the offseason with Jack Eichel, I'm not going to be like, failure. You failed. doesn't matter that you got Seth Jones. Doesn't matter that you got Jonathan Bernier. You failed because you didn't get like a game-changing forward. No, it's very tough to do. I'm not going to hold them to that standard. Same deal with like the second defenseman. I think they really do need a second top four defenseman, especially because I don't know what Phil Myers is at this point. And there's a decent chance in reality that they might have to trade Phil Myers to get that top pair defenseman. So suddenly you need another guy. But if they end the summer and they only added the top pair guy and they go in with, Provorov, top pair edition, Sanheim, Braun, either Ghost or York, and then Myers or whatever, hey, whatever. Like that works. It's not ideal, but it works. But you need that top pair guy. You need that upgrading goal, and you need to clear cap space. That to me is the bare minimum of the offseason, what they have to do.
Gotcha. You were talking earlier about the dynamic player, and the first team I thought of, what would the Islanders, as good as they are and as much of a system team as they are, and proof that can get you so far, what would they be, though, without Matt Barzal,
Yeah. It's a really good point. I mean, he adds that element where, they have three lines that they roll that just wear you down. They play, fundamental hockey. It's all about defense. But they got that one line with that guy who at any moment can change a game. And that just adds a different dynamic to their team that the Flyers very clearly lack, and they've lacked for a while. They've really lacked it since Giroux started slowing down. Because when Giroux was in his prime, he was that guy. 100% was that guy. Yeah. Giroux has done a great job, and don't take this to me to be, criticizing Giroux. Giroux has done a fantastic job of adapting his game to stay a very effective forward as he enters his mid-30s. But he's not that dynamic weapon that he was when he blew up Sidney Crosby and then scored the first goal of the game in Game 6 of that series against the Penguins years ago. Like, he just can't do that anymore. You can't do that when you're 33, 34, unless you're, one of the true elite players of all time. And even those guys, like even Alex Ovechkin, can't do a lot of the things that he could do when he was 24. Like, it just happens. You get older, you can't make the same plays, you adapt your game. And he's adapted his game, but he's not that guy. And it would be great if they found a way to get that guy.
Yeah. Is Johnny Gaudreau in that category?
I would put him in that category. I would say that over the last couple years in Calgary, he probably hasn't been that guy, but he's young enough that you trade for him and you think you can get that guy back, especially, you're bringing him back to, kind of where he grew up and, a new environment. Maybe the environment in Calgary's gotten a little toxic in terms of just, underachieving and whatnot. You bring him to a new place, maybe you spark him. I would say Gaudreau, to me, qualifies as a dynamic player that defenses have to be aware of when he's playing his best. And he's young enough that I would be willing to take the risk that he can get him back to playing his best.
So one thing you brought up when I think you were talking about a dynamic forward in your article was something to kind of spice up the power play, because it's been kind of stale. I mean, we're kind of used to seeing the same thing. One guy internally that I'm kind of excited about, not because I think he's going to become a dynamic scorer on the power play, but someone that I feel like maybe could, as soon as this year, develop into a top power play defenseman and could kind of change the way that they funnel their power play, is Cam York. And so I was kind of interested in, what your thoughts were on his NHL stint. I've heard a lot of good things about, I didn't see any of the Phantoms games, but heard a lot of good things about what he was doing down there on the power play. He's a guy that, there's not a whole ton of optimism this offseason, but he's, for me, is a point of, I'm hoping that he can be on the third pair, if not to open this season, shortly thereafter, get some sheltered minutes, but really become that top power play guy. And I'm just curious in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I've been told quite a few times by people I talk to that, if the Flyers have an untouchable prospect, it's Cam York. And it's not because they think Cam York is going to be the superstar, but it's because they think that he fills such a need on this team that they really don't want to trade him. And a lot of that plays into the power play, because my view of the way that they think of the power play, and this is part of the reason I think this plays into why, something that pops up on Flyers Twitter all the time is the idea of, like, why isn't Shane Gosper on the top power play unit? And there's a point to be made, because I completely agree with them that Shane Gostisbehere is a better power play defenseman than Ivan Provorov, who was getting the bulk of the minutes on power play one, or whatever unit had Claude Giroux on it, which is functionally power play one, even if it's not the first over the boards. But I do think that the way they look at the power play philosophically is that they don't want their power plays to be bombs away power plays from the point. They don't have Wayne Simmons anymore to create that traffic. They don't have the elite bumper option in the slot to do deflections. They want the guy up top to be more of a facilitator. And Cam York is a facilitator. I mean, that's his skill on the power play. He's an extremely decisive passer. He sees the ice extremely well. So I think they look at Cam York as having the type of skill set from the back end that fits what kind of power play they want to construct. And because of that, I think they see a lot of value in him, because they've been missing that guy, under Fletcher, they've been missing that guy from the start. But they look at him and it's like, this is the guy who will quarterback the power play the way we want it to be quarterbacked, because Ghost is at heart a guy who's going to shoot bombs from the point. That's what he's good at. That's his strength. And Ivan Provorov, he has the wrist shot. I don't think he's super decisive as a passer. He's certainly not as decisive as York when York's playing his best. So I think there's a lot to be said for, York being the guy who will run the power play the way they want it to be run. Now, whether that fixes the power play, that's another story. Maybe them running the power play that they want it to be run, that doesn't necessarily solve the problem, which is that, who on that power play do you really have to spend all your time defending? It's pretty much Giroux, who's not much of a shooter anymore, at least on the power play. So you just cover everybody that he can pass to and you're in good shape. But I do think York will help. I think York will help. He'll make the power play, whenever he gets here, he'll make the power play more of what the coaching staff wants it to be. Now, again, whether that's enough remains to be seen, but I think he'll help.
Do you think there's a reasonable chance he could be on the team to start the season?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's a lock. I don't think a spot's going to be handed to him. I also think they probably would like him to maybe get, some time in the AHL, but I 100% believe that if he has a good training camp, that he will be, they won't keep him out. And that's one of the reasons why I don't have a major issue if they end up trading Shane Gostisbehere to clear cap space, to make some moves, to open up that 4.5, because York will essentially play Shane Gostisbehere's role, both at 5-on-5 and on the power play. And if you think Cam York is close to being ready, and I think they do, maybe, and I think Shane Gostisbehere had a solid year this past year, but Shane Gostisbehere kind of becomes not redundant necessarily because he's a good player, but you saw what happened when the Flyers tried to have Shane Gostisbehere and Erik Gustafsson both in the lineup. They're two guys that needed the same type of usage. You could only give that usage to one of those guys, and ended up being a disaster. You move Ghost out, you slide York into that third pair left-handed shot spot and give him sheltered minutes and have him play power play one. That's Ghost's ideal role, but you've got a younger guy who maybe, is the first guy that the Fletcher regime drafted. So obviously they like him, and, he's physically, I think, pretty close to ready. Talent-wise, is pretty close to ready. So, if you need to clear cap space, that's why I've theorized that moving Ghost out could make some sense, because you have York pretty darn close. Whether he makes the team out of camp, whether he's on the team 2 months, 3 months into the season, I'm not sure. But barring injury or a very disappointing season, I would be shocked if York isn't on this team, by the second half of next season.
Just a couple more from me, Charlie. Appreciate you coming on. Is there any talk within the organization of a couple prospects that are ready to raise their profile, whether it's Jay O'Brien or Ronnie Attard? It doesn't necessarily have to be one of the higher profile prospects.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I know they really like Ronnie Attard. Obviously, he went back to school for another year, so we'll see how he does at Western Michigan. They still feel good about. So I believe he could theoretically sign with another team at the end of this season, but they still feel confident that he's going to sign. I think they feel like they have a good relationship with him. That he just wanted to go back for another season. I know they like Noah Cates a lot. They also think that he'll sign, even though he could theoretically jump. He's a guy who the organization really likes as a kind of a Swiss Army knife, bottom sixer type player. So those are two guys that I hear a lot of good things about, when I talk to people, in the organization, that they're higher on them than the industry consensus is on those players. They obviously, really liked what they saw from Wade Allison at the end of the season, if he still counts as a prospect. I mean, I'm not 100% penciling him into a roster spot, but I think he put himself in very good position to, start out next season on the third line. He looked real good in those last 3-4 weeks of the year. So they're certainly high on him. I think they like Tanner Luzinski a lot if he can come back strong from from his offseason surgery. So there's certainly guys in the prospect pool that they like and have high expectations for. But I don't necessarily think guys like Addard and Cates at the very least they're not going to have an impact this season because they're both going back to college for one more year.
Oh sure, yeah, no doubt about it. But it's good to hear some of those guys that you don't hear about are kind of moving up a little bit, and they might poke their heads up and surprise some people. So good to have that. Last one from me, Charlie. Just because you're so well known for analytics and effective use and kind of insinuating them into your pieces so well. If for people that are, I guess, the uninitiated, or maybe they go to just Hockey Reference and look at expected goals and Corsi and stuff like that, is there a website that you could recommend for more of the beginner or intermediate, or someone who wants to dive in but maybe not get caught in quicksand of analytics, just kind of like covers like A to D instead of A to Z, that you could recommend?
Yeah, actually, I mean, there's definitely been a fair share of articles and explainers and things like that. I mean, I'll toot my own horn for a second. I've actually done 2 primers on advanced stats. One, I believe, is my pinned on my Twitter feed.
Yeah.
But that was like part 2. That was a little bit more advanced, but I that responds to the initial one, which I wrote in 2017, which was like the bare bones. What is Corsi? What is expected goals? Why do we put it in a percentage rather than just raw numbers? Just like things like that. The very rudimentary questions that you're going to look at and you're going to have if you're trying to get into this stuff. So I mean, I'll recommend what I wrote. I think it's almost entirely still up to date. I don't think there's anything that's necessarily not applicable still, especially if we're just talking about the basics. The second one is certainly a little bit more complex, and I would say stay away from that until you have an understanding of the base level concepts. But yeah, and that's, I think, a good place to start. And then it's just, if you're interested, just poke around. And I mean, I'm always certainly open to answer any questions people have on Twitter and whatnot. I obviously enjoy this stuff. I find it interesting, and I really want as many people as possible to understand it and enjoy it as much as I do, because I think it has value in terms of helping us to understand the game.
Yeah, absolutely. Dan?
Not much else. I guess one thing I would ask, we kind of talked about the expansion draft a little bit. In terms of the actual NHL draft, I guess, what is your gut instinct on whether or not they're going to have that first round pick to make a selection, or if they're going to end up using it, to do whatever in a trade?
I think my gut is that they trade it, but I don't think it's a foregone conclusion. It has to be the right move. They obviously, their scouts spend, hours upon hours upon hours, days upon days, weeks upon weeks studying these guys. I don't think they're just going to give that pick away. I'm sure they have guys they like. What I've been hearing is that, all things considered, they'd like, if they keep the pick, they'd like to get, to beef up their depth at center, and they're drafting early enough where there could be a couple, high-end center prospects available at, technically the pick is 14, but it's functionally 13 because the Coyotes lost their pick. It's early enough where you get a guy like that. But I do think that, knowing what I know about their desire to be aggressive, I think there's a decent chance they trade the pick. But I'm not going to go out and say that they're definitely going to trade the pick. It has to be in the right deal and for the right player. And I mean, if they end up, let's say they end up pivoting to Dougie Hamilton, and Dougie Hamilton decides he's okay with going to Philly, suddenly you don't need to trade that first round pick to get that top pair defenseman, and then maybe you end up keeping it. So there's a lot of different ways this can play out. The reason why I don't think they're opposed at all to trading the first round pick is that I know for a fact that they were completely open to trading that first round pick at the deadline until the team fell apart. But like in in late February, early March, when I was trying to figure out, like, okay, what are the Flyers' plans at the trade deadline, assuming the Flyers were going to be a playoff team, everything I heard is like, look, we'll trade that pick. If it comes down to it, and that's what it costs to get the player we want, we'll trade that pick. And the only reason why they didn't trade that pick is because why were you going to throw a first-round pick at a lost season? But when they didn't think the season was lost, they were willing to trade the pick. So if you're willing to trade the pick back then, you're certainly going to be willing to trade the pick now.
Yep, makes sense.
I think I would agree with that.
Yeah.
That's all I had.
Yeah, so Charlie, man, thanks so
Great.
much for taking all this time. Really appreciate it. People have to check you out at The Athletic. Where else can people find you? I guess you're going to be busy in the 8-day crunch from the 21st to the 28th.
It's gonna be a ride. I'll tell you that. It'll be really interesting. They won't be going to the draft because it's all remote. But as I said, I'm expecting a busy off season. I'm expecting a busy off season for myself as well. But yeah, obviously I write at The Athletic. Which is, for anybody who doesn't know, it's a subscription-based site. But we always have deals. So if you want to, take it for a test drive, I'm sure you can find one of the deals we have out there that's, for a couple dollars a month just to see if you like it. That's where I write. On Twitter, my handle is CharlieO_Con. I also am one of the co-hosts of BSH Radio, our weekly podcast. So you can check me out there, and you don't have to pay for that. So that's not behind a paywall. But yeah, it's pretty much where I work. And obviously, I'm tweeting on Twitter, and as the Flyers, make moves or don't make moves, I will certainly be providing, my opinions and also the information that I've been hearing, from, people close to the team and around the league and whatnot. So keep an eye out for that.
Excellent. Charlie, man, thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, you got it. Thanks for having me, guys.
All right, man. Take care. There you go, Dan. Hey, I got to remind people, and I know, Dan, it's that time of the show that you kind of cringe, but your mouth waters because we got to remind people.
Oh, no, not the cheesesteak.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry. Jim South Street calls.
So good.
400 South Street, 40
I just
years.
want one. I need one.
Yeah, well, 40 years of the best Philly cheesesteaks, hoagies, fries, you name it, in the grandest Philadelphia tradition, with or without, it doesn't matter. And listen, if you live down near 400 South Street and you can't get over there, don't worry, they use DoorDash. You'll get that delicious food right to your door. So check them out. Jim South Street, 400 South Street, right in Philadelphia, PA. And brother, that's a hell of a show we just had.
Yeah, Charlie's the best, man. He's originally, when I started getting into Flyer social media and whatnot, I was, listening to him and, on the Broad Street Hockey podcasts and reading his stuff. I mean, he's like a great story of someone who kind of, you've been able to see him professionally as sort of ascend to where he is now, where he's like the foremost Flyers writer. Him and Bill Meltzer, to me, are really the gold standards. And so, no, it was really, really great to have him on.
Yeah, absolutely. So we mentioned there was going to be a big crunch of activity. The July 17th is the expansion.
Buckle up.
Yeah, deadline for protection list, and then it starts. The 21st is the draft. 22nd, we're scheduled to come back with Russ Cohen for a draft preview and an expansion draft wrap up. I can't guarantee if I'll even be here, but there'll be an O&B Puckcast in some form or fashion. So, Dan, why don't you give him your information, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, so folks can follow me on Twitter at dsilver88, the 88 for Eric Lindros. They're not going to be able to get an Eric Lindros in this year's draft, or really in any draft, but one of a kind. But so, yeah, at dsilver88, and I'm ready to see what happens this offseason, and I'm excited.
This is it, man. It's going to be a best offseason since 07, or at least it better be. So it better be. You can catch Chef, who should be back with us, Chef to the Left B on Twitter, at Chef to the Left B on Twitter. And myself, Isaiah, ISAIAH _520 at Isaiah. Don't forget the _520. Of course, we have a Facebook page, a YouTube channel. We're on 12 podcast platforms. We appreciate if you could rate and subscribe, particularly on Apple Podcasts. And of course, you can follow the O&B Puckcast on Twitter at O&B Puck, at O&B Puck. And really, it does help us out if you rate and subscribe, moves us up the charts. When people are looking for Philadelphia Flyers podcast, and as always, it's free. So until next time, supposedly the 22nd, we'll see you then. We'll have Russ going. Take care, everybody.